Thank you, as usual, to Malaprops for all that you do for the writing community and for Great Smokies in particular. And thank you to all of you for being here, both here in the store and virtually. I wanted to make a couple of announcements before I introduce our panelists. One is that we have some spaces in classes, spring classes for Great Smokies, or sort of spring, winter, spring, I suppose. One that I wanted to highlight is Jackie Castle's Writer's Room for Novelists, beginning this week in person. We're moving some classes back to in person, and this class will meet at Hanger Hall starting this Tuesday, 6 o'clock. So there's space in that class, and there is space in Bruce Pang's poetry workshop that begins March 21st. So check out those and other classes online at our website. Also, this Saturday, the 25th, right? I think it's the 25th, Lauren Haar from Gold Leaf Literary will be at UNCA doing a workshop on how to submit work, which should be a nice natural progression from this discussion. So she will talk to us about how to submit work and help us submit work. And you can find more information about that at our website as well. All right, and thank you also to our panelists for being here. I really appreciate you all taking the time. I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three panelists. They're all have had different experiences in the publishing business and writing different types of things. So I'm eager to hear what they have to say. We're going to open with them each saying a few words about their publishing journeys, and then we will open it up to questions. You all may ask questions here or at home. At any point, if you all have questions, feel free to ask. And I will ask questions as well. So hopefully we'll all leave here with a lot more inside information into publishing. So first we have Jackie Castle. Jackie is an educator and novelist living and writing in the Blue Ridge Mountains. She's been published in a variety of publications, including Mountain Express, WNC Woman, Asheville Grit, and Explore Asheville. Her novel, The Seclusion, which School Library Journal called a must-have for all libraries and fans of sci-fi, garnered her the title of 2020 Indie Author of the Year through the Indie Author Project. Jackie has taught creative writing through the Carolina Mountains Literary Festival, the Young Eager Writers Association, Indie Author Project, the Writing Heights Writers Conference, and more. When not writing, Jackie can be found hanging out with her family and consuming far too much caffeine. It's true. I didn't bring you any, I'm sorry. Next, we have Heather Newton. Heather's novel, The Puppeteer's Daughter, has been optioned for television. Her short story collection, McMullen Circle, was a finalist for both the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award and the W.S. Porter Prize. Her novel, Under the Mercy Trees, won the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award, was chosen by the Women's National Book Association as a Great Group Read selection, and named an Okra pick by the Southern Independent Booksellers Alliance. She teaches creative writing for the Great Smokies Writing Program and Charlotte Lit, and is co-founder and program manager for the Flatiron Writers Room. And last but not least, we have Joanna Sullivan. Joanna is the author of 10 award-winning books for young people, both fiction and nonfiction. Her debut young adult novel, Between Two Skies, was a Southern Book Prize finalist, Junior Library Guild Selection, American Booksellers Association Best Books for Children, notable from the National Children's Literature Assembly, and more. As a journalist, Joanna's covered books, arts, design, travel, and general features for the Asheville Citizen Times, WNC Magazine, Afar, and other publications. She's a contributing reporter for Publishers Weekly. She has taught creative nonfiction and feature writing at UNCA and is a book editor and currently works with aspiring authors on manuscript and proposal review. Please help me welcome all three of these panelists. Jackie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and thanks to Stephanie and Patricia, I'm not sure where they're at, for having us. It's always such an honor to be here in this welcoming space, either virtually or in person, and to see all your faces and to the virtual audience. I will just go ahead and kind of just give an overview of my path to publishing. And I think that is kind of how we're going to go tonight, and then we'll open it up to a Q&A. So I have been a freelance writer and journalist for about 15 years, but only started writing fiction in 2016. And so that was very interesting because I've been published in a very different world, which it sounds like maybe some overlap there as well. But when I went to, I wrote my first novel, and I'm sitting there looking and wondering what to do with this piece of work that, I was not an expert on. I knew that I needed some helping hands. I considered, the path to querying. I considered self-publishing, but I also knew that I needed a team of professionals to help make this as good as it can be, because fiction was not something that I had a lot of experience in. And so I ended up working through a hybrid publisher that was called Inkshares, and what they do is it's kind of a mix between something like Kickstarter and traditional indie publishing. And so they hold pre-order campaigns for a book. And so in order to get the publishing contract for my debut novel, The Seclusion, in 2018, I sold 750 pre-orders for this book. And so it was intense, I will just say that. So if that's a path that you're want to go on, it is a great way to say, okay, I know a lot of people, I have faith in my writing, I think that I can network well, maybe crowdfunding is a world you're comfortable in, then it is a good way to, it is a possibility. It was incredibly difficult. I don't think I would ever choose that path again. But as soon as, it did reach that goal, then I had a team of professionals step in. And so they offered everything a traditional publisher would. They offered developmental editing, copy editing, cover design. It had widespread bookstore placement, was entered into competitions, and luckily garnered a few awards that were able to get my name out there. And so, it was one of those doors that at the time I was writing, my books are dystopian sci-fi. It was very timely, and at the time I was like, I just want to get it out there. Looking back in retrospect, I don't know if that's the path I would have picked, but I was glad that I did it at the time. The sequel came out with that same publisher without all the hoop jumping. And I'm not sure what will happen with my next book. So I have another book that I'm about ready to query, and that will probably go into the traditional querying process and see where that leads me. But it was a really wonderful way just to get my foot in the door, and then to work with folks who were able to get that book to where it needed to be, and show me what it takes really to take a manuscript from submission to, sitting on these shelves. I will pass it over now.
Great. I love that. That's a really interesting, creative way to get a book out there. That's awesome. So I have 3 published books. I published one with a big 5 publisher, one with a small publisher, and one with a mid-sized publisher. So it's kind of like the 3 bears or something. It's like, this one is too hard. And I would say there's been positives about each experience. Obviously, with a big publisher and a mid-sized publisher, they pay you in advance, which is really kind of nice. At least it gives you some money to pay for your publicist and, the book tour and things like that. Small publishers don't. You wait until the book is out, and then you earn royalties once the sales start. Another advantage of a big 5 publisher is that they pretty much automatically can get your book reviewed in the trades, Publishers Weekly, Library Journal, Book List, the big ones. Whereas those publications pretty much, in my experience, ignore small press books that don't have a big print run. So publishing with a small press, you have to be a little more creative about getting reviews. And then, of course, a big publisher gets your book out in the world. Your book will be in Barnes and Noble for a few weeks. Whereas with the smaller presses, the book will be in the shops that you form relationships with, the independent bookstores that you go to, or where you know someone, where you've cultivated a relationship. So, I mean, those are the sort of the advantages of a big publisher. I will say that in my experience, one thing that is not so great about the larger publishers is the amount of staff turnover. My editor at the large publisher left a month after my book came out. And then the acquiring editor for my most recent novel left a month after she acquired my manuscript. So whole new editorial team, and then the marketing and publicity people, just, it's a revolving door. Whereas with my small press experience, the small press that published my short story collection is a passion project of the two women who run it. They're not going anywhere. There hasn't been any turnover that I've been aware of, and that's been really nice. Just sort of the stability of that. Yeah, I've been pleased with all three in terms of the product. Like the books are good, the editing process was good, it was professional. The books, the quality of the books was, I thought good. So they've all kind of been good in that regard. Trying to think about other differences. One advantage of the mid-sized publishing house is that they had connections to the film and TV industry. So they had an agreement with a producer who acquires content for Sony Television, and they acquired my book with an eye to optioning it to TV. So that's how that happened, and that did not happen with my first book with the big publisher. So there's pros and cons, and no publishing. None of the three have been perfect, but overall, I think they've been good experiences. So that's kind of my 2 cents worth.
Okay. Yeah, so I came to publishing from, my first job out of college, we'll go way back, was in magazine publishing, but I started working in book publishing when I moved to Asheville, and I worked at Lark Books, which was a wonderful publisher. It was based here for a couple of decades, and Lark did, excuse me, craft, activity, lifestyle, home and garden kind of books, but it was a great entry to me. I started maybe, I think, August 1st, and I had a deadline to produce a book maybe August 25th. So I had like 3 weeks to write a book, and I immediately was like, I can't do that. And then I was like, oh, okay, I want to do well in my job, so I guess I'm doing it, and did it. And so I ended up writing a lot of the in-house books, and that got me confident enough to start proposing or thinking of book ideas that I could produce and try to sell. All the while, I really just wanted to write fiction, and I did that eventually. Worked with a mid-sized publisher also, with the traditional route. I don't like self-promotion, so I did not think that I could do self-publishing. I just didn't think I could do it. So that was kind of off the table for me. And I think that's pretty much probably, I would think about it, because I think a lot of people do really well at it. I like to have a specific genre or community, but the kind of stuff that I write generally is not that. It's more, a one-off kind of more literary story. So I didn't think that would work for me. So yeah, I agree with Heather. It was great. It was a debut novel, so my publisher was able to get, a good amount of traction, but also, as both you guys have mentioned, having been friends with people at Malaprop for years was really helpful. And also Spellbound, she was working at Publishers Weekly. She got me a column in PW. Also, just my local experience covering books. I had a books column in the Citizen Times for like 5 years. That led me to be able to get to PW, which, it's kind of peeking behind the curtain about what goes on in publishing. So that's been helpful. So I agree with both you guys. There's so many different routes that you can take, and it's really individual to your project. And I think it can feel, and we've probably all felt this way, like there's, you know, some sort of gatekeeper or some magical key that you get to and then you're published, but it doesn't really work that way. There's lots of different access points, I think.
So I want to know what does go on behind the curtain.
You know, it's interesting. Like Heather was saying, the big five really, you know, dominate. That's no secret. But it depends where you are on their list. Are you an A book, a B book, or a C book? Which of course they don't really publish that sort of thing, or that's kind of just an internal in-house thing. But you know, I do think if you are with a big five, a lot of your success is going to depend on if they decide your book's going to be a success, it's going to probably be a success. And for everyone else, you know, you kind of have to work really hard. But another thing that I kind of have realized from doing that, from writing for PW and also from teaching at UNCA, is just something I didn't really understand very fully before, was that books are a form of media, and every form of media is in conversation with the other forms of media that are out there. So movies, television, video games, music, and book publishing is influenced by those forms of media, just as those forms of media, some of them, films in particular, or TV, are influenced by books. And so there's this sort of circular motion going around about narratives that are kind of out there at the moment. And a lot of people are like, well, such and such is selling these days, or such and such is popular these days. And that is true. Like if you happen to have written something that, you know, was like Bridgerton last year or 2 years ago, you'd be in a great position because that's kind of in the ether. But that doesn't mean that you have to write something about Bridgerton. If you try to write something about Bridgerton now, you're probably too late. Like it's moved on to something else. But that's just kind of an interesting thing that has kind of come together for me. Seeing what's coming out and just kind of looking at other forms of media as a teacher. 2 cents on that.
Thank you. Another question, I'm wondering if some people know what we mean when we're talking about mid-sized publishers. And I don't know if any of you want to speak to that, but.
Yeah, I'll speak without really knowing what I'm talking about, but I think it has to do with the number of titles they publish per year and their overall operating budget per year. And maybe, you know, how many imprints they have and how many other smaller presses they've eaten up. So they're the big five that everyone's probably all familiar with. And for a while there, we thought it was going to go to the big four, but the courts put the nix on that. But I keep saying big four and my agent's like, there's still big five. There's still five. So, I mean, mid-size, they, you know, as I said, they can afford to pay in advance. They have, you know, perhaps a better distribution and marketing budget for your book than a teeny weeny press would. So that's all I know, is that it's sort of in that mid-level where, you know, maybe you try the big five first because you want the money and you want the marketing support, but then there's all these other presses sort of in the middle tier that are perfectly respectable and large enough to at least get your book out there in the world.
Right, and thank you. And for some people, I think it depends on the mid-sized press. Some mid-sized presses, you need an agent. Some mid-sized presses, you don't need an agent. Some you need an agent in a particular genre and not in another genre. Yeah, so it's a lot of kind of going to each individual, you know, figuring out what the publishing landscape looks like, figuring out where you might fit, and then sort of trying to just going to each one and seeing what they require, right?
I think a nice way to do that is also just look and, you know, browse some books and see who their publisher is. And, you know, look up some of the mid-sized presses that maybe you're interested in and look and see if their top books from that year are selling. And I think it's also gonna be a little bit like the top 5 where they're going to have their A, B, and C list even at medium-sized publishers, which is, you know, it's hard to navigate. But also, you know, their connections. Are their authors getting reviewed in Publishers Weekly? Are they getting reviewed in School Library Journal? So a medium-sized press, if they have those connections and they have that networking ability, is still able to have those conversations in the industry. You know, if you stumble upon a small press that, you know, maybe their book has 5 reviews, then that may be a red flag to just, you know, move on a little bit. And I will mention that there are a lot of predatory presses out there. And so that might be something we want to touch on, is that, you know, a lot of people are trying to get published, and the world knows that. And they're, you know, if someone is asking you to, you know, pay to publish your own book, then that may be a red flag. Look and see what's going on. And if the books that they're putting out there are selling, or if they're, you know, just kind of coming out and floating there.
That's a great point. And also, if an agent is asking for money up front, that's not done as well. So Heather, do you want to talk about having somebody look over any kind of contract that you might sign?
Yeah, please, have somebody look over your contract. So I'm a lawyer by day and a writer by like whatever time I can find. And if you have a contract from a traditional publisher, you can join the Authors Guild, and the Authors Guild, as one of your member benefits, will review your contract for you. They also have great seminars on things to look out for in contracts. Do not just sign it. It's amazing. And I don't even think it's intentional sometimes. I think sometimes, especially with small presses, you know, they're grassroots, they're not lawyers, they got a contract off the internet, and they try to get you to sign this contract, but it may contain really problematic terms. You may be giving away rights that you should be keeping, things like that. So you won't have a lot of bargaining power as a new writer, but you should at least go into the relationship with your eyes open about what you're giving away and what you're giving up. I think there's real value in that. Don't just sign it and then, you know, down the line run into trouble.
I saw recently an article on how there's so many other things that writers can negotiate other than just money, just advances. And we tend to think in terms of just how can I get more money? But are there things that you all wish maybe you had gotten that you had bargained for that you didn't at the time, or things that you bargained for that you're glad you did?
My agent is also a lawyer, so she kind of does all of that. And I'm like, yeah, sure, whatever you say, that sounds good. Like, she'll be very precise about things, and probably more precise than I would be. So on my most recent contract, it took a while. And there was some little thing, I can't even remember what it was, but she went back and forth. It took a while. It seemed not super important, but it was like, well, they're not giving you that big of an advance, so let's see if we can get this other thing. So.
Yeah, one thing I negotiated with my small publisher, their contract, their standard contract had authors giving, you know, licensing their film and TV rights and their audiobook rights. Which actually have separate value. And I knew I wanted to keep my TV and film rights, and that was not controversial. The publisher agreed to that without a problem. And then on the audio rights, they wanted to keep it because they were kind of looking ahead at their business model, and they did plan to start getting into audiobooks. So what we agreed on was that if they didn't exploit the audio rights within a certain number of years of publication, those revert to me, and then I can exploit the audio rights. So don't think of your copyrights as one big blob. You know, you can carve out the different things. And a lot of the non-monetary things are kind of not controversial, and you can negotiate a little bit, even if you feel like you don't have any bargaining power.
I'll say too that it's okay to go back and renegotiate if you have to, that the door isn't necessarily always closed. So I ended up kind of renegotiating my audio rights when the second book in my series came out, and getting those to revert back to me so that I was able to do those together, you know, with the same narrator, even though, you know, the books were several years apart. And so I think that it's okay to advocate for yourself if you aren't working through an agent. I think just getting to know other people in the industry who are authors and maybe have gone through a similar process. It's a very friendly industry, I think, on the author side. And so just, you know, asking folks to look over, you know, your contract and talk to them openly about it and make sure that you're getting a fair deal. I suppose one of the only other thing other than optioning rights would be the length of your contract. So if you're going through a bunch of work and someone's only offering to print your book for 3 years, you might want to know why that is. I think general is about 10, maybe. Do we know?
It just depends. The thing to look out for in a contract like that is the out of print clause, because when they stop providing it through normal distribution channels, you want to get your rights back so that you can find another place that will put it out there. So I think if you address that part of it and you haven't given them, you know, the rights in perpetuity, even if they're not keeping it on the shelves, then that's the main thing. University presses are one of the few advantages of publishing with a university press. I shouldn't say that, that's not really true. One advantage of publishing with a university press is they take pride in keeping their work in print forever. They pay a lower royalty, and that's the trade-off typically, but they do keep it in print forever. So if that's something that's important to you, then university presses are something that you should look at.
I would say too, and this is, I have one book by University Press. I would say the promotion of that book and marketing team is not the same as with my, you know, it's a different, they have a different purpose. So it's not quite at the same level with a university press. The other thing I would say that I've seen in contracts is a right of first refusal on your next book. And I think that's an interesting thing to consider, you know, and they have different reasons for asking that, but both of my contracts ask for that. And so I think that's something I might try to negotiate. And I can ask questions all day. Does anyone here have questions? Anyone online have questions? Yes.
I'm curious for those of you that went through the mid-size and the larger publishers, if you used your agent or if you were able to submit directly.
And can they hear that online, or should I repeat? The question was, I've forgotten the question. For those who used mid-size or traditional publishers, did they use an agent or submit directly?
The big five all require agents. So I used an agent with the mid-sized publisher as well. I'm not sure if they take unagented submissions. I think they might. It's Turner Publishing out of Nashville, and they might very well take unagented submissions. And then I handled the sale of the short story collection to the small press on my own, because agents make their money on a percentage of your advance, and when it's a literary short story that's probably only going to sell like 200 copies in its entire life, she was like, "Oh, you can handle that part." So yeah.
I also work with an agent for all the books that I've, no, how many has it been? 3 since I started working with her.
I did not work with an agent, but I plan to work with an agent for any future book. And I think that is just the process that I've learned over the last trying to think of what 5 years of, of being an author and having books published is that relationship, not just in negotiating your deals, but also that relationship in deciding what you pursue next is also really something that I've been craving. It's like, okay, here are some book ideas that I'm tossing out. I need a partner in this to help me figure out which door I'm gonna walk through. And that's another thing that an agent can provide for you.
I was gonna say, the other thing your agent can do is kind of be the bad guy for you so that it preserves your good working relationship with your publisher. And I mean, as a lawyer, I'm always telling my agent, tell him this, tell him that, like, I don't wanna do that, I wanna do that, but I'm over here all smelling like roses, she does it for me, so that's a good thing.
I think the time I was most grateful was, other than selling my book, was with the first cover that they proposed for my novel, which I almost cried. I was like hyperventilating on the stoop of my house because it was so bad, and I thought it just didn't really capture my story, and it was going to be marketed all wrong. And so I told my agent. She went back and they worked with me on it, and we came up with I felt like I couldn't push it anymore after the third, but I ended up liking the third one I came up with anyway.
What else? Other questions here? Yeah.
I have a question that's not related to contracts or agents, but I wonder if you want to speak to that interim time, which shocked me when I first heard it, between the time that your book actually sells and the time that it actually ends up on a bookshelf, which now is a year and a half, 2 years. And what happens for you in between? What are you doing in between that time, besides, of course, working on your next book?
That's a great question. So the question was, what happens in the interim time for a writer in between when a book sells and it's coming out, and the year and a half, 2 years, I don't know, maybe you all have had a quicker journey when the book actually appears on the shelves.
I have a good one on this. I have a book coming out next October that I sold in November of 2020. So, and they also wanted to push it back till spring of 2025. And that was another time it was good to have an agent where she at least got it pushed up a few months. But yeah, honestly, there's, I mean, you work on other projects, but that's one of those things that you don't control, and that's one of the many.
And of course, like the peripheral activity, like trying to find tie-in publicity things that you can do, and all that. I'm just curious if you guys want to go through that a little.
I think it's for the first step is how much work does the book need? So if they're going to have you be making substantial rewrites. So my first book, I probably rewrote the entire last third of that book. It's completely different than what it was in the draft that was accepted. Whereas the sequel to that book did not really change. A few characters got dropped. We rewrote a little bit, changed the pacing a bit, but it was essentially the same book. But that can take, an entire year of just rewriting it and rewriting it and rewriting it over and over ad nauseum. And then as soon as you're done with the developmental edit, you go into copy edit. At some point you're looking at pictures of each single page of your book, and you're giving them notes because you're working on PDFs instead of in Word documents anymore. So there's just a lot of that little nitty gritty stuff. And then I think on average, your book is pretty much done about 6 months before it comes out. And so, at least that was my experience. Then you're figuring out, you're sending the arts to bookstores, you're starting to line up the events and interviews and figuring out your marketing campaign. But yeah, the book that you turn in, especially for a debut, is probably not going to be the same book that's going to come out 2 years later. And that's great, because that's what those professionals are for, to help push us and to make those stories better. But yeah, be prepared, because it is a little shocking the first time you go through it.
They're also gonna have your publisher is gonna have you doing things like hitting up all of your friends and acquaintances for blurbs. I had to write a letter to booksellers for the packet that they would submit to indie booksellers, and sellers associations. It was like, why should we carry your book? And I'm like, because. And I had to do a marketing plan where I suggested to them which publications, which media might be receptive to doing a story on it, or what cities have you lived in? Where do you know people? What platforms might you have? All this kind of thing. How big is your mailing list, your newsletter mailing list? And another thing that you should be thinking about doing, whether they ask you to or not, is once the book comes out, you're going to get a lot of requests for like guest blogs, interviews written, and face-to-face interviews. You should be working, just have some in your pocket, these little pieces about the book, like, the where the ideas came from, or interesting research that you did along the way, or how it ties into some current topic. Do that before your book comes out, because you really aren't going to have as much time after your book comes out to do it.
I'll speak to that a little bit from my national media experience, which is the amount of space in any, first of all, there's barely any print publications left. Even in digital media, the amount of space devoted to books, new books, books coming out is just minuscule. And I think a lot of people don't realize that, and they kind of go into it thinking, well, when is the New York Review of Books going to review my books? And it's, again, it would happen maybe if your publisher, it was an A-list book and they put 6 figures into your marketing. But so you have to really be very targeted with the community that you think is going to be receptive to your book. So if you are in a genre like speculative fiction or crime, there's great organizations for crime writers and mystery writers. It's just, you have to build those affiliations yourself. And you can get, a hit here or there, or again, like with your local publications, that's great. But the reality is it's not going to move the needle that much. And I think your relationship with your bookseller, honestly, is probably going to be a lot more effective, because they're going to hand sell your book when you come into their store, which I can say that Malaprop is the best. Great.
Absolutely. Other questions in-house? Yes, we have one online, it looks like.
So this is pretty specific, not necessarily to publishing, but it's how difficult is it to get permission to use quotations in nonfiction works? But I don't. So anybody who's worked with nonfiction, I guess.
Jennifer. That is something my publisher did for me. So do I need to repeat the question? Can they hear it?
No, just in case. Yeah.
How difficult is it to get permission to use quotations in nonfiction works? Well, actually, Heather taught me that I can't just quote a whole song in an essay in a workshop she did for Great Smokies a number of years ago. And I wrote that down, and it's in a notebook somewhere at home where Heather says I can't do this. I'm not going to do it. I had, in my last book, I did have several passages from books, and there was a rule that the publisher knew that was like, I can't remember how many words, there were so many words I could use as long as I attributed it without getting permission. And so I just relied on them for that, for this last one. The first one, I don't think I used any quotations. Anybody else?
I'll just speak to, in the fiction world, as long as it's in the public domain, you can quote as much as you'd like. And so if you're interested in quoting older texts, then that, you are able to quote those as lengthily. Is that a word? Lengthily.
It is now.
Cool.
And depending on what type of nonfiction you're writing, there are permission services that, deal with granting newspaper permissions. So if that's what you're working on, you can do that. The real stickler is song lyrics. First of all, it's hard to find out who owns them. it's probably Sony, they own everything. And then they will give you permission, but they will charge you a lot more, most likely, than you're getting from sales of your book. So there are workarounds. You can use song titles without a problem. Titles can't be copyrighted. You can allude to the song without quoting the lyrics. So there are some creative things that you can do.
Yes, okay, great.
Oh, you can go first.
Just going back to a question that Joanne talked about a little bit, which is the cover war. Did you, either of you guys have any experiences with your covers, negative or positive or anything?
Oh, I love that question too. So the cover wars, the writers like to talk about their covers because it's such an exciting time when your cover is revealed and you've been waiting, and then you have a picture in your head, and then maybe the team has another picture in their head. So anyway, that was the question.
I do have a cover story. So the art departments at publishing houses use, like, image subscription services like Getty Images and that kind of thing. So for my first novel, my editor, I think he thought I wasn't gonna like it, and he sent me the cover, and the cover is a person dipping their toe in a lake, and there's no lake in my book. There are mountain streams, there's no lake. But I kind of defer to the publisher. They know what sells, and I was like, well, that's fine. Well, then the book comes out, and our local Citizen Times reviewer made the observation that one of Ron Rash's books had the exact same cover image. So Ron is like 50 miles down the road and much more famous around these parts than I am. And my publisher, who was also his publisher, had somehow decided to use the same image on our book covers. Luckily, it was an edition of his book that hadn't been as widely spread as some others. So that was one image. And then a cousin of mine called up because shortly after my novel came out, she saw it on the remainder desk at a yard sale or something. And she was so upset that somebody was selling it. And she went over to it, and it was a Christian romance novel that had used the exact same cover image. So here's the lesson I learned from that. When your publisher sends you the mock-ups of possible covers, do a reverse Google image search and see where that picture has been used before you agree to your book cover.
That's just an amazing story. I can't even believe that they were the same publisher that used the same stock image. I was very lucky with both of my covers, and then I absolutely loved my cover designer. The one thing I'll say is that you don't, unless you are going to go to bat for a very specific reason, you don't have a ton of say over your cover. They're going to, basically play what sells. But we kind of had a funny stock image story as well, where the background to my first book was, a woman standing in front of a cement wall, and so there were lots of kind of stock images overlaid to make this final graphic. And they sent it to me, and I was just like, I'm just gonna zoom in real quick. And I zoomed in, and there was all of this graffiti, like when you zoomed in at the micro level, that they had not caught. And some of it was incredibly graphic. But I'm like, can we make sure that we zoom in and clean this up a little before we, mass print this? And so that was kind of the only fun story that I had. But I was very fortunate that I really fell in love with both of my covers. But it was kind of, here are the mock-ups, we're going with this one. Not really a lot of wiggle room.
I felt like I was really lucky with my first cover. With both, I like both a lot. The first one, I think a lot of people were drawn to what was kind of what I thought of as kind of a serious story with some lighter moments, but it was a fun cover, and that was sort of a reflection of what the marketing team did with the book. And so it was fun, and a lot of people have told me that they were drawn, they bought the book just for the cover, and so it's exciting when somebody buys your book for any reason. So they buy it for the cover, that's great. And they do all this, the marketing departments do all this research about what covers are trending. colors and what, what designs, and there are trends in colors and also design. So I figure they know a lot more about that than I do. So yeah.
So I have a question, but also make a comment as a bookseller about covers if anybody cares to hear it.
Yes.
So first of all, Fat Broke with Two Goats is an excellent cover, and it did sell just for the cover. The content's also amazing, but we saw people picking, people just, it's like they were drawn to it, right? And so you shouldn't judge a book by its cover, folks at home, folks in the store, but people absolutely do, because that's our lizard brains doing that. And so, they're one of the reasons why we have blind date with the bookseller is because books are often disserved by their covers. And so people don't pick them up when they should. They're great books on the inside, but whoever made the decision about the cover just didn't get it. And so it's marketed to people who it shouldn't be marketed to, or vice versa, or it's just not very well designed. So I just want to, not that you have a lot of control, but it is, I'm just gonna, from our perspective, when we're like trying to sell books for you, basically, when we're hand selling books, it is a great place to jump in if you see something going horribly awry with your
Pornography on your book cover.
Like, you definitely want to jump in and say something, unless you're Ann Patchett, who apparently can decide what's on the cover of a book, like otherwise you don't have a lot to say.
Could I just add to that, also the title?
The title also,
yes, with the cover was, I
Yeah.
think, I bet was because the title was.
yeah, part of it was the genius title, and because that's part of the cover. The typesetting is, that's a whole other road to go down too. But it was well put together, great title, great cover. I'm picturing all covers from all of you they're lovely, and again, don't disserve your books. So it is something to think about, and it's also something to think about if people are, with smaller presses. I'm not a published author, but I do this, right? Look at their covers and see what you think. Because if you aren't drawn to buy the books that if you're not drawn into, if they're not good looking, right? Then that's gonna, there are many books on the shelves that people have to choose from. And they're like angels getting their wings every time the bell rings, right? It's happening as we speak. Right? So so just throwing in my 2 cents.
Thank you. And I think you brought up another thing, which is titles. Does anybody want to say anything about titles? Anybody have an interesting title story?
My book went out with a different title that I had come up with, and my agent came up with another one. It sold with that title, but then we changed it after the book had been edited. And she asked me, "Do you have any title ideas?" And it was from a line in the poem that features prominently in the book. So it changed 3 times, and I was happy with the one.
Yeah, my agent refused to submit the book until we had a good title. So the original title of my book, Under the Mercy Trees, was Looking for Lenny. Can't imagine why she thought we should get a new title. And oh my God, we made lists and lists and lists. And finally, I got my mother to come up and bring all of her shape note hymnals so that we could look at song titles and hymn lyrics, because that was sort of the vibe that we wanted. So if any of you have ever met my mother, so she came up and she started singing each of the hymns, and I was like, we ain't got time for this. We do not have time to sing all the hymns. Just look through, pick out line, and we came up with Under the Mercy Seat is what my mother suggested. And then when I talked to my agent, she said, how about Under the Mercy Trees? Because the book featured a grove of trees, and she thought it felt more encompassing. So that's how we arrived at it. But it was a long, hard journey.
Both of mine changed as well. The Seclusion was that title probably from the very beginning stages of development. It was different than the title I queried it with. But the sequel, I don't think we decided on the title pretty much until we were ready to send out the ARCs. It was a very last minute decision, everything. I think with the sequel, it's tricky because it has to kind of play with the first title, but not be repetitive. The other thing that I have found interesting through talking to other authors is to look up and see if there are other books with that title already. And then also if that title could be misconstrued. For instance, I had a friend who wrote a book about vampires that worked in the corporate world, and what I thought was a brilliant title, which was Human Resources. But if anyone looks up a book of that title, they're not going to find this novel. They're going to find a bunch of books on human resources. And so, you know, it's interesting just to kind of play with what titles have been done. And then, yeah, and then again, you know, there's some books that have been sold because people think they're a different book.
We have another question back here.
Yeah, Jackie, you talked about, you went with a hybrid press. Would you describe what they did? Well, you kind of did, but you also hinted that you wouldn't go with a hybrid press again.
I wouldn't say that I wouldn't go with a hybrid press. I think that I will probably move on to an agented relationship just at this point for me. I think hybrid presses you need to do a lot of research on them. So even more than regular medium-sized presses, I think there are a lot of hybrids out there that don't have the author's best interests at heart. I was fortunate that this one that I was working with is doing really wonderful things in the industry. They've optioned several books that came out at the same time as mine. They are selling. They have one that's becoming an Apple series right now that came out, you know, a month before mine, and are run by really wonderful people. But it took a lot of kind of digging and talking to other authors and making sure that was a relationship I wanted to enter into. There are a lot of hybrid presses out there that, you know, are charging authors $8,000 up front to publish their book. And if that's the means to the end, and you want, you know, you're deciding between that and self-publishing and possibly putting that same amount of money into those services like developmental editing and cover design, then if that hybrid publisher has a decent track record and you can talk to their authors and see that they're you know, carrying on respectful relationships, then it's definitely something to consider if that's the path you want to go. I think that publishing is changing a lot, and COVID, I think, has changed it a good bit. So I don't want to discredit any method. I would just say that research is really important, and checking out what other authors who have worked with those presses have to say. So,
And comparison shop, just because somebody has accepted your manuscript at a hybrid publisher, and it's great to, you know, get that affirmation. You can call around and comparison shop. We at Flatiron, we offered a class on self-publishing with a woman named Nora Gaskin, who is she does a great job, and she's helped many writers through the self-publishing process. And it cost about $3,500 to do a good job self-publishing your book. So if you get a quote of $12,000 and the publisher is really not going to be doing anything more than you would be doing to promote your book, then call around and, you know, find out who could do it for less. Don't just take the first figure just because somebody's flattered you by accepting your book. Stephanie.
Yeah, so question from home, this is from Jenny Blue, and it's for you, Jackie, specifically, and actually it's sort of what you were just talking about, a specific question about e-shares and whether or not there's a royalty payout before or after the book's pre-sale.
So the way that they do the royalty contract, it's after those initial orders. But then it's a very standard royalty agreement. And so it's every 3 months, and we can talk about that too, just the insight into how our books are selling, which is a fascinating topic.
Let's not talk about that.
But yeah, so their royalty structure was very similar, but it was that those pre-sales were going into the development process for your books and paying the editors. I was lucky that the second book, kind of because it had done well, kind of foregoed a lot of that. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of what it was, and I was fortunate that the book has done very well, but there are similar situations where maybe a book didn't really go anywhere after that, and then the royalty checks didn't really come because there weren't a lot of books sold after that first batch. I feel like I had something else I was going to add. to the previous question, and now it slipped my mind.
Can I interject then and ask you another question about the
Sure.
750 books?
Yes.
So how did you do that? I mean, did you have somebody help you with that campaign? How does that work?
I think I've blocked it from my memory.
Did you have 750 friends?
It was a lot. I mean, if anyone has crowdfunded anything, you know, it's a lot of just kind of putting in the legwork and finding folks to support you. I did a lot of just kind of putting it out on social media, and you're able to put your first chapters. So you're able to invite people to kind of read those first chapters and support the project. But that is what I was going to say, is that if you also have the skills to crowdfund, and if I say had crowdfunded 750 books and then taken the money that I had earned from crowdfunding those 750 books, then I would have also had, you know, a nice option to do self-publishing well myself. And so there are other opportunities where if you think you have a good social network and the marketing skills, and you're comfortable with the process of self-publishing, then there are options other than bringing all that money out of your own pocket.
Can I just add something to the question about hybrid publishing? Find out distribution, because I'm a bookseller, and distribution is everything. If you're self-publishing, you're the distributor, and getting your own book out of your trunk of your car into the store is going to be really, really hard. I'm the consignment buyer here at Malaprops, and I say no a lot. Yeah. And I wouldn't have to say no if it's just available from Ingram or like distributed widely. So make sure if you're looking at hybrid publishers, you are. That wasn't okay. That they have distribution.
I feel the need to
Yes.
repeat this for people at home,
Yes.
because I think it's really important, we were saying that it's really important to have a distributor for your book, or that you've considered who the distributor will be, because distributors are how the book gets from the publisher to the bookstores. So if you don't have that, it makes your life really difficult as a writer.
Yes, I will echo that. But as you're doing the research, that needs to be one of the main things. Is this going to be placed, you know, in a widespread way? Are we able to walk in and just have our booksellers order it easily? And I believe Ingram is the main distributor these days. So
There are a few others, but if you're on Ingram, then you can be pretty much everywhere.
And another related question to ask your publisher when they make an offer on your book is whether the book is returnable, because that's what bookstores care about. If they can't sell all 20 copies that they ordered, they want to be able to return them without a problem. And if you have gone with, say, a print-on-demand company or someone really small who doesn't allow returns and doesn't use, you know, normal percentages for distribution, then the bookstores are going to be reluctant to carry it.
Yes. So kind of piggybacking on all of that, do you guys want to speak at all to how writers get paid? Not necessarily dollar amounts, but percentages, and who they're paying, depending on what model they're using and all of that good stuff?
The question is, do they want to talk money? I would say that there is a trend on Twitter, at least, lately for people to start posting, here's my advance, to sort of remove that secrecy behind that whole process, so that, you know, writers understand that not everyone gets a six-figure deal up front for their very first book. Some people do, but it's such a wide, there's so much variety in what advances are paid, if any, and how that process works. So I think it is important for us to talk about. So yeah.
Yeah, actually, Joanne put me onto this thing. It's called Publishing Paid Me, and someone had put together a spreadsheet, which is probably still available, of people voluntarily sharing the advances that they had been paid. And some folks who are well known, and you would have expected that they get paid a decent advance, theirs were surprisingly small. So I mean, it's pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, I can't believe Roxanne Gay got what, 25,000 or like $7,500 or something for her first book. It's like, are you kidding me?
And Jasmine Ward got some incredibly
got
small
25,000,
amount for
yeah.
one of, and she was already well established, so, yeah.
Yeah,
should
for
have been
a
bigger.
national book award winning, but it, you know, of course, they didn't know that at first, but still, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Someone was telling me the other day, you know, it's the 80-20 rule, like 20% of your books or a publisher's book is gonna make 80% of its money. And the rest of the books, they don't necessarily expect to do very well. And so honestly, they don't put that much into marketing those extra books. It's a really broken and sort of antiquated model, in my opinion, and in many people's opinion. And I do see that there's more sort of innovative things on the horizon. I feel like people are starting to consider different ways of publishing, but that sort of logjam or that you know, hidebound tradition of how advances are given and you know, the whole revenue model has been working like that for a long time. And it doesn't serve authors very well anymore. It used to serve authors better maybe 20 years ago, you know, before the internet. It's probably more than 20 years ago. But authors end up being the ones who are often getting the short end of the stick on the monetary situation. I won't say anything too controversial, but I think most authors would say that they, you know, the amount that you get per book, if you do go with a traditional publisher, you know, part goes to the distributor and part goes to your publisher and part goes to the bookstore. By the time you go through all these layers, the amount that is there for the author is not very much. That's helpful.
It is nice to know that Joanne has an Excel spreadsheet that has this, and I'm just like, it's just gossip on Twitter that I'm relaying to you all. Quality.
I will share it with you. Thank you.
I think we're about at time, so thank you all so much for being part of this conversation. I've learned a lot. I hope you have too. If you're interested in joining Great Smokies Writing Program for some classes, please be sure to check those out on our website. And thanks again to you all for coming, and to Malaprops for hosting us, and especially to our 3 panelists here.